I remember the silence after surrender, not the silence of peace, but the emptiness that follows collapse. Our division had laid down its weapons somewhere near Remagen in April 1945. We were the remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division, a name that once carried pride, now only hunger, lice, and hollow faces. Show desaturated close-up of weary German soldiers walking with raised hands. The Americans surrounded us quickly, efficiently. Their tanks were everywhere, Shermans, half-tracks, trucks that seemed endless. I'd fought on the Western Front for 3 years, but I'd never seen anything like their logistics. Endless columns of vehicles, all clean, all fueled, all moving like a machine that never tired. One of the officers next to me whispered, "They have more trucks than we have rifles." He wasn't exaggerating. For us, the war was over. But the journey, that was just beginning. We were herded into a vast enclosure near the Rhine. It wasn't a camp. Not yet. Just open fields fenced with barbed wire. Tens of thousands of us. Soldiers, boys, officers, medics, all sitting in mud. There was no shelter, no tents, just the cold and the smell of unwashed bodies. Show wide aerial shot of the Rheinweisenlager POW camps. We were told we were prisoners of the United States Army. That sounded almost like a relief, compared to what we'd heard about Soviet captivity. "The Americans will treat us fairly," someone said. "They are civilized." But there was no food the first day, nor the second. Just rain. I remember an American soldier throwing a piece of bread toward the wire. A dozen men jumped for it. The bread was trampled into the mud before anyone could eat it. That was when I realized. The war might have ended, but the suffering hadn't. A few weeks later, they began selecting groups, young, healthy men. We didn't know where we were going. Some said England. Others whispered, "They're sending us to the US." We laughed at that. It sounded impossible. Across the ocean? We could barely stand, and they'd ship us across the Atlantic? Then the trucks came. Show convoy of US Army trucks driving through mud. We were loaded into the back, 20 or 30 men per vehicle, and driven to Le Havre, France. The port was a sea of metal cranes, Liberty ships, warehouses, thousands of soldiers moving in perfect coordination. For men who'd seen Germany bombed into rubble, this was another world. Everything worked. Everything moved. Everything was abundant. We walked past endless rows of cargo crates marked U.S. Army. Inside them, food, cigarettes, uniforms, typewriters, radios, even ice cream machines. One of the guards caught my gaze lingering on a box of canned peaches. "You'll eat better soon," he said in rough German. I didn't believe him. At the harbor, we saw the ships, enormous, gray, towering like steel fortresses. I'd served near the Channel before D-Day, but I'd never seen vessels this size up close. The Americans called them Liberty ships, mass-produced freighters that had won the war as much as any weapon. Show Liberty ship loading prisoners under the watch of U.S. guards. Each could carry hundreds of men. The scale of it was incomprehensible. We'd heard of American industry, but seeing it was like stepping into another universe. We were marched up gangways, issued numbered tags, and pushed below deck. The air was hot, thick with oil and sweat. The engines vibrated through the floor plates. For many of us, it was the first time on the sea. The ship pulled away as the sun went down. Through the porthole, I watched Europe fade into the mist. That was the moment I understood truly that we had lost. The crossing took almost 2 weeks. We slept on narrow bunks stacked 4 high, ate white bread, corned beef, and strange sweet coffee. It was more food than we'd seen in months, but we could barely taste it. Show dim interior of crowded ship hold, flickering light from above every night. I listened to the hum of the engines. Constant, mechanical, perfect. There was something terrifying about that precision, that endless rhythm of production and motion. We Germans had believed in our engineering. But this was something else. The Americans didn't just build machines. They built a system that turned machines into victory. Point one evening, a sailor allowed me to stand on deck. The sea stretched endlessly, black and cold. Above, the sky glowed faintly with the northern lights. I thought of home, of my mother in Dresden. If she was still alive, I didn't know. No one did. The sailor handed me a cigarette. "You'll like it in America," he said, smiling. I nodded, though I didn't believe him either. When we finally saw land again, it was like a dream. New York Harbor, a skyline of glass and steel unlike anything in Europe. The Statue of Liberty stood there, tall and serene. I remember thinking how strange it was to arrive as a prisoner under her gaze. Cut to shot of Liberty ship approaching New York Harbor, Statue of Liberty in distance. We docked early in the morning. A brass band played somewhere on shore. Civilians waved from the piers. They weren't cheering for us, of course. A troop ship filled with American soldiers had docked nearby, men returning home. They were laughing, shouting, embraced by families. We watched from the deck, silent. That sight hurt more than any defeat. One of our guards said quietly, "Home for them. Work for you." He wasn't joking. After processing, they loaded us onto trains. Not cattle cars, real trains, clean, with soft seats and even windows. The contrast was surreal. We traveled west for days, through Pennsylvania, Ohio, the endless plains. At every station, we saw abundance. Huge factories, miles of farms, towns untouched by war. Children waved at the train. Some threw candy. Show montage of trains crossing rural America, waving civilians, no bombed ruins, no shortages, no rubble. It felt like we were crossing into another civilization entirely. One of the older officers muttered, "Now I understand why we lost." And none of us argued. We arrived at Camp Concordia, Kansas, just before sunset. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the prairie. Guard towers, barbed wire, but also gardens, workshops, even a small theater. The American officer in charge greeted us in perfect German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said. I almost laughed. After the mud and starvation near the Rhine, this place looked like paradise. We were given showers, deloused, and handed clean uniforms marked PW. The water was hot. I can still remember that feeling. For the first time in months, I didn't stink of death. That night, as I lay in a real bed, I couldn't sleep. Outside, the wind howled softly through the Kansas grass. Inside, a light bulb glowed, bright, steady, reliable, and I thought, this is the country that beat us. But I didn't yet understand how deep that truth went. That realization would come later. In the factories, in the fields, in the way they lived, worked, and believed. Because soon, they would let us see America up close. And that was when the shock truly began. The first morning at Camp Concordia felt unreal. After months of mud, starvation, and fear, I awoke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Show early morning sunlight through barracks window, steam rising from tin mugs. An American sergeant, probably no older than I was, walked through the barracks, calling out orders in English. I didn't understand all of it, but his tone wasn't cruel, firm, professional, almost polite. We lined up for breakfast. On the tray, eggs, bread, butter, jam, even fruit. I stood there staring, unable to move. Behind me someone whispered, "This can't be real. They're testing us." But it was real. And that breakfast, that simple act, was the moment I began to understand that we were inside a different world. After the meal, we were divided into groups. Some were assigned to clean, others to work in the fields. I volunteered immediately, anything to escape the walls, to feel useful again. Show line of POWs walking out to the fields under guard. They took us to a farm just outside the camp. The land stretched endlessly, flat and golden, dotted with tractors that looked enormous to us. American farmers waved as we passed. Their wives brought water and sandwiches to the workers. It wasn't forced labor. We were paid 50 cents a day in camp coupons, enough to buy cigarettes, chocolate, even magazines at the canteen. I remember the first time I saw an American grocery store. Shelves stacked to the ceiling, canned goods, sugar, coffee, soap. It was overwhelming. We Germans used to joke about the myth of American abundance. Now I saw it with my own eyes. The Americans had a word they used often: plenty. It was everywhere. Plenty of food, plenty of machines, plenty of land. I couldn't stop thinking about home, about my mother standing in line for a loaf of bread, about my city in ruins. Here, nothing seemed scarce. Even the soldiers smoked better cigarettes. Show close-up of German POW lighting a Lucky Strike, gazing at horizon. At night in the barracks, we talked about what we'd seen. Some of the men were angry, others ashamed. One officer said, "If we had had this industry, this organization, we would have won." But another answered quietly, "No, we had machines. What they have is discipline without fear." That line stayed with me. Every day, we saw more of America's power, not through weapons, but through order. The railroads ran on time. The factories never stopped. Even the small town near the camp had electricity in every house, radios in every kitchen, and cars on every street. Show montage. 1940s American town. Cars, neon signs, families, stores. The guards weren't brutal. They didn't need to be. The system itself was stronger than any threat. One Sunday, they let us attend a church service with the locals. We walked in under guard, sat quietly in the back pews. The preacher spoke about forgiveness, about rebuilding after war. Afterward, families came up to us, German soldiers, and offered their hands. A woman gave me an apple pie. Her son, about 8 years old, smiled and said, "My dad was in France." I didn't know what to say. That I went back to the camp and cried that night. Not from guilt, not yet, but from confusion. How could people whose homes we had bombed treat us like human beings? Some of the men were sent farther away, to Nebraska, Colorado, even Texas. I was transferred to a work detail in a machine shop that repaired tractors and harvesters. Show sparks flying in workshop, German prisoners working alongside Americans. That's where I truly saw the engine of America. Rows of machines, all standardized, all replaceable. If a part broke, they didn't repair it, they swapped it. We Germans would have spent hours making one perfect gear. The Americans made 10 in the same time and just kept going. It was efficiency, not perfection, that had won them the war. The shop foreman, a man named Bill, treated us fairly. He spoke slow English, always with a cigarette in his mouth. One day he told me, "You guys built good stuff, but you built too little, too late." He was right. Weeks passed. Then months. We got used to the rhythm: work, eat, write letters, sleep. The Red Cross brought mail from home, though most of it was grim. My father was missing. My brother dead near Königsberg. My mother living in a refugee shelter. Show reading letter under dim light, face expressionless, then trembling. There were men who couldn't bear the news. One hanged himself in the latrine. Another went mad. But for most of us, life went on. We found a strange kind of peace here. Safety in captivity. Some even joined a choir. Others studied English, drew sketches, built model airplanes. The camp had its own library and even a theater. I played a small role once, a soldier coming home from the front. The irony wasn't lost on me. We began to realize that we were witnessing something monumental, a society that could destroy and build at the same time. Factories that once made bombers now produce cars. Shipyards built tractors. The same machine that had defeated us was already feeding the world. Show transition from wartime footage of assembly lines to peacetime production. That contrast was hard to comprehend. In Germany, war had meant annihilation. Here, it was a brief interruption, and the Americans never bragged about it. They just kept working. At night, I lay awake listening to the sound of trains far in the distance, that steady hum of motion. It reminded me of the ship's engines on the Atlantic, endless, mechanical, unstoppable. That was America. By autumn of 1945. Rumors spread that some of us might be sent home. Others said we'd stay to help with the harvest for another year. I didn't care. The camp had become my world now, predictable, almost peaceful. Then one morning, a group of American officers visited the camp. They said we'd be part of something called a work education program. We'd travel, see more of the country, work in different industries. At first, I thought it was punishment, but it turned out to be the most revealing experience of my life, because they were about to show us not just their weapons or machines, but their way of life. And that was something no army in the world could have conquered. The first time I saw an American assembly line, I felt as though I had stepped into the future. It was 1946, and our new assignment had taken us to a tractor factory near Des Moines, Iowa. Show wide shot of 1940s American factory floor, workers moving rhythmically between machines. Inside, everything moved. Belts spun, pistons clattered, sparks flew. Men shouted orders above the hum, but it wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Every tool, every motion, every second had a place. In Germany, we had been taught that quality came from craftsmanship, from precision, from pride in perfection. But here, I saw another philosophy: speed, scale, repetition. The Americans didn't worship the machine. They mastered it, and they did it with smiles, jokes, music playing from the radio. That was what stunned me most. Our job was simple: lifting, cleaning, sorting metal parts. They trusted us enough to work without constant guard supervision. There were rules, yes, but also a sense of respect, not for who we were, but for what we could do. Show German POWs working side by side with American civilians, laughter faintly audible. At lunch, we sat with American workers. They shared their food sandwiches, apples, even Coca-Cola. One of them, a tall man named Frank, asked me in broken German, "You fought at Normandy?" I nodded slowly. He looked at me, then shrugged. Hell, that was a long time ago. To him, the war was already history. To me, it was yesterday. Every day I saw proof of what had won the war. Not ideology, not luck, production. Trains carrying raw steel rolled in one side of the factory. Finished tractors rolled out the other. It never stopped, not even Sundays. Back in Europe, even before the bombs fell, we never had this rhythm. Our industry was built for precision, not power. America was the opposite, imperfect, but infinite. Show montage, steam rising from factory stacks, cranes lifting engines, endless rows of tractors. Sometimes, during my breaks, I'd walk behind the factory. There were fields stretching to the horizon, dotted with windmills and grain silos. The sound of the machines mixed with the wind, the smell of oil with that of soil. And I realized something simple, almost painful. This country was alive. Night, we returned to our camp barracks. this time a smaller compound outside the town. It was almost comfortable. We had heating, electric lights, and even a small radio. That radio became our window to America. We listened to baseball games, swing music, speeches by President Truman. I didn't understand half the words, but the tone was confident, open, free. Show shot of POWs huddled around a radio, faint static sound, jazz playing softly, freedom. That word meant something different here. Not freedom we'd heard in propaganda. This was freedom built on order. Freedom that worked because everyone believed in the same rules, even if they didn't fear punishment. It puzzled me endlessly. Some of the Americans were curious about us. 2.1 evening. A local teacher visited the camp and asked if any of us would speak to her students. She wanted them to learn what the war was really like. I volunteered. I stood in front of a classroom full of bright-eyed children who'd never heard a bomb fall. I told them what hunger felt like, how cities burned, how comrades died screaming in the snow. They listened silently. When I finished, a girl raised her hand. She asked, "Do you hate us?" I froze. Then I said, "No, we hated lies, not people." Show classroom scene, the POW standing humbly before American children. That day, I felt something shift inside me. The enemy had vanished. What remained were human beings, confused, scarred, but trying to understand each other. As months passed, many of us became almost Americanized. We learned the language, the gestures, even the humor. Some guards joked that we'd return to Germany and start a baseball team. We laughed. But deep down, we knew we had changed. The war had stripped us of everything: pride, certainty, belief. But here, in this strange land, we were learning again how to work, how to think, how to exist without fear. Show POWs playing soccer on camp field, guards watching casually. Sometimes, I wondered if this was the Americans' real weapon, not their bombs or tanks, but their ability to rebuild, to forgive, to keep moving forward. In Germany, defeat meant despair. In America, even victory meant work. One day, Frank, the worker I'd befriended, invited me to his family's farm for dinner. It was against regulations, but the guards allowed it. I remember stepping into that house. The warmth, the smell of roasted meat, the laughter. His wife smiled at me. His children stared curiously, but not with fear. They asked about my home, about my family. I told them, haltingly, about Dresden, about my brother, about the winter of 45. Frank's wife placed her hand over mine and said softly, "You'll go home soon. You'll help rebuild." It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like a prophecy. Show soft-lit scene of dinner table, contrast between light and shadow. That night, walking back under a vast Iowa sky, I looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over us in Europe. For the first time since the war began, I didn't feel like a soldier. I felt like a man again. In early 1947, the order finally came. Repatriation. We were going home. The Americans held a ceremony, brief and practical. They gave us certificates of good conduct, new clothes, even sandwiches for the journey. Before I boarded the train, Frank shook my hand. "Good luck, Hans," he said. "Don't start another war." I smiled. Not this time. Show handshake between POW and American worker, fading light of sunset. As the train moved east, I watched the fields pass by, endless, golden, peaceful. I thought of all I'd seen. The factories, the farms, the people, the system. And I realized that we hadn't just lost a war, we'd lost to an idea. The idea that freedom could be organized, that power could exist without cruelty. We left New York Harbor on another Liberty ship, this time headed east. The The Statue of Liberty stood behind us again, but now I understood her better. She wasn't a monument to victory. She was a promise that even from defeat, something new could rise. Show final shot. Ship disappearing into morning fog, Liberty in the distance. I didn't know what waited in Germany, but I carried with me something more valuable than pride, understanding, and for a prisoner of war, that was the first step toward freedom. The ship reached Bremerhaven in March 1947. The sea was gray, the air colder than I remembered. The docks were quiet, too quiet and no crowds, no bands, no flags, only ruins and wind. Show slow pan of shattered German port city, cranes half sunk in rubble. We stepped off the ship in silence. Each man carried a small duffel bag marked PW. We were thinner, older, but clean, healthy. That it felt almost wrong to return that way, fed and dressed, to a land that looked starved and broken. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp concrete, smoke, decayed. It wasn't the Germany I'd left. It was a ghost of it. The rail station. I waited 6 hours for a train. There was no glass in the windows, just plastic sheets flapping in the wind. The tracks ran through bombed-out cities, Hanover, Magdeburg, Leipzig. Everywhere, people scavenged through debris, carrying firewood, bricks, or corpses. Show trains slowly passing through ruins, hollow faces looking up at it. Once, I saw a group of children playing with a twisted metal wheel, laughing. That laughter cut through me more than any battlefield. We had lost the war, yes, but worse, we had lost our childhood, our future, our innocence. When I finally reached Dresden, I couldn't recognize it. Streets where I once walked with my brother were now just piles of blackened stones. The Frauenkirche lay in ruin, its dome cracked open to the sky. Show aerial view of Dresden 1947 ruins, dust swirling between broken spires. I walked for hours, looking for the building where my mother used to. Live.it wasn't there. Only the remnants of a basement and a faded iron stove that I sat beside it until night fell. A neighbor finally found me and told me she'd heard that my mother was alive. Living in a refugee camp outside Pirna. It took me 3 more days to reach her. When I saw her, she didn't recognize me. That I was taller, thinner, and the uniform, though stripped of insignia, still marked me as a soldier. But when she looked into my eyes, she began to cry. Show emotional reunion. 2 figures embracing amid tents and rubble. We had both survived, but neither of us was the same. She had lived through the firestorm of February 45, hiding in a cellar for 2 days. She told me, "The city burned, Hans. The air itself was fire." There was no hatred in her voice, only exhaustion. She asked me what America was like. I told her the truth. Clean, working, alive. She nodded, not in disbelief, but in quiet acceptance. For the first time, she smiled weakly and said, "Then maybe there's hope. Life after the war wasn't life, it was survival." The country was divided into zones. The Soviets ruled the East with an iron hand, the Americans, British, and French the West. Everywhere, hunger and cold were constant companions. Show montage. Bread lines, black market stalls, people pushing carts through ruins. I registered with the authorities, received papers, and was assigned to help rebuild roads. It was brutal work, but it gave me purpose. I found myself repeating habits I'd learned in America. Organization, teamwork, efficiency. Others laughed at me. "Why do you care? It's all gone." But I couldn't stop. I'd seen what rebuilding looked like. I'd seen what order and discipline could create without cruelty. The first winter was the hardest. We slept in basements, patched holes in walls, burned anything we could find for heat. Food came from rations. Watery soup, black bread, dried turnips. Show candlelit interior of ruin, people huddled in blankets. Sometimes I thought about Iowa, about the fields, the warm lights, The sound of the trains that IT felt like a dream I'd once had. But that dream gave me strength. I remembered what Frank had said. You'll help rebuild. And somehow those words became my reason to wake up every morning. Then, in 1948, something remarkable happened. From the West came news of an airlift. The Americans were flying food and coal into Berlin after the Soviets cut it off. Show archival shot. American C-47s dropping supplies over Berlin. I watched as people whispered in disbelief. The same country that had bombed us only years before was now saving our people from starvation. That IT was impossible not to feel something. Gratitude, confusion, shame. All at once. That was when I realized America's true power wasn't just its factories or wealth. That IT was its ability to forgive, and to act on that forgiveness. By the time the currency reform came and the Deutsche Mark replaced the worthless Reichsmark, I was working as a mechanic in a small workshop. We repaired whatever could still run, trucks, tractors, even old motorcycles from the war. For the first time, I was earning real money. Not much, but enough to buy bread and shoes. Show mechanic wiping grease from hands, faint smile of tired hope. I sent half of it to my mother each month. Every evening, I stayed late to teach apprentices what I had learned in America. How to measure efficiency, how to plan production, how to fix things instead of waiting for orders. Slowly, the workshop began to grow. One day, my boss said, "You're like an American now." I smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. The world outside was changing too. East and West Germany were no longer just zones. They were becoming two different nations, and we were all caught in between, unsure which side of history we belonged to. Some of my old comrades joined the new police. Others disappeared across the border. That I stayed, because for the first time in my life, I wanted to build, not obey. Show transition. Cranes rising over rebuilt city skyline, sunlight breaking through clouds. Sometimes at dusk, I'd hear the sound of a distant train. That IT always reminded me of Kansas, of those long, endless plains, and the steady hum of industry. That IT was strange, but that memory comforted me more than any speech or flag, because it meant that even out of ruin, something new could move again. But peace wasn't as simple as rebuilding walls or roads. That IT meant confronting what we had done, and what we had believed, and for men like me, that was the hardest part. The guilt didn't vanish. It lingered silent, invisible, heavy. We never spoke of it aloud. But it was always there, between every laugh, every handshake, every meal shared in the new Germany. That was the war's true legacy. Not hatred, but silence. That I sometimes think that's why I survived. Not to fight, but to remember to carry the story of what we saw, in defeat, in captivity, in renewal, and perhaps to remind those who came after that strength without mercy destroys itself. But mercy, even from an enemy, can rebuild the world. The years after 1949 passed like a gray blur. Germany split in two, not just by barbed wire and politics, but by spirit. I in the East, slogans and fear replaced freedom. I in the West. Work became religion. Show aerial shot. Berlin divided by makeshift barriers, citizens walking between rubble and new construction. I lived in the western sector, in a city still scarred by fire but already buzzing with life again. Factories reopened, trains moved, and new shops appeared on streets that had once been piles of ash. People were hungry, not for food this time, but for purpose. And for many of us, that purpose was rebuilding what we had destroyed. By then, I was 30. I'd started working for a small engineering firm repairing farm equipment. A strange echo of my days in Iowa, AT first. Our tools were old, our machines loud, our hands raw. But something inside me burned quietly, a determination to prove that we could build again, not for war, but for life. Show mechanic at workbench, faint smile. As machine hums to life, when I looked at the factory floor, rows of young men hammering, welding, shaping metal. I sometimes felt the same rhythm I'd heard in that American factory years before. The difference was the sound of our voices. Softer, humbler, grateful. For the first time since the war began, I felt proud again, not of uniform or rank, but of creation. Still, the past never truly left. It followed us, in the faces of widows, in the hollow eyes of those who returned from Siberia, in the silence that filled every dinner table when someone mentioned 1945. Show family eating in silence, faint ticking of a clock in background. We didn't speak of guilt. We built instead. It was easier to hammer steel than to confront memory. But at night, when the machine stopped and the air went still, the ghosts returned. The smell of burning oil mixed with the phantom scent of cordite. The sound of a passing train became the drone of bombers in my mind. Sometimes I woke up sweating, hearing voices calling names I no longer remembered. War doesn't end when peace is signed. It ends when the memories stop hurting. And for us, they never really did. In 1951, I received a letter from America. It was from Frank. He'd found my address through the Red Cross. He wrote about his family, the harvest, the new tractors rolling off the assembly lines. The bottom. In simple handwriting, he wrote, "Do you remember what I said? You'd help rebuild. I hope you are." Show letter on wooden table, soft light from window, hand tracing the words. I read that line over and over again. It was as if he knew exactly what I needed to hear. Because that same week, our firm received a contract to supply machinery for the Marshall Plan reconstruction projects. We were rebuilding Europe with American aid, using American tools. And I, a former prisoner of war, was part of it. It felt like closing a circle I hadn't even known was open. The Marshall Plan changed. Everything money flowed in, roads and railways rose again, cities regained their shape. And with each year, the ruins disappeared, replaced by glass, steel, and hope. Show montage, cranes rising, smiling workers, children playing among new buildings, but hope came with a price. Memory faded. People stopped talking about the camps, the dead, the crimes. Let's move on, they said. The future is what matters. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't forget, because I'd seen both worlds, the one that destroyed and the one that forgave. And I knew that forgetting was just another kind of danger. In 1954, I visited the cemetery where my brother was buried. The grave was simple, just a small cross among thousands, and no medals, no honors, just silence. Show wind blowing through rows of identical graves. I knelt and whispered, "Would you have understood, Carl, that our defeat might have saved us?" For years, we had been told that honor meant obedience, that victory justified everything. But standing there among the dead, I realized real honor was surviving long enough to change. The dead had no more lessons to learn, but the living, we still could. That same summer, I was invited to a veterans meeting in Munich. I almost didn't go. But curiosity won. The hall was full of men in gray suits, their faces lined and tired. They spoke of old comrades, lost battles, and the futility of it all. But then one of them, an old Luftwaffe officer, stood and said, "We were good soldiers, but we served a lie. We must ensure our sons never do the same." Show close-up of veterans lowering heads in silence. No one applauded. But every man in that room felt the truth of it. It hung in the air like smoke, bitter, but cleansing. That night, I walked through the city alone. The streets were bright with neon, full of laughter and music. The new generation didn't remember rubble or hunger, and I hoped they never would. I often thought of America then, of the endless plains, the order, the optimism. They had shown us that strength wasn't cruelty, and that mercy could be power. Show archival shots of 1950s America, highways, factories, families, Germany was beginning to learn that lesson too. Our factories hummed again, our people smiled again. But this time, the pride was quieter. It wasn't shouted in parades. It was built into every bridge, every car, every brick laid by hand. By 1957, 12 years after the surrender, I finally allowed myself to dream of peace, real peace. I married a nurse named Anna. She had lost her father in the war, yet she never spoke of bitterness. We met at a hospital where I repaired equipment. Her laughter reminded me of something I thought was gone: lightness. Show soft-lit domestic scene. Anna tending plants, sunlight through window. She once asked me, "Do you still think about America?" I smiled. Every day. Because what I saw there taught me how to start again. But even as life returned, I knew that some scars never healed. That I saw them in the veterans on park benches, in mothers waiting for letters that would never come, in the empty chair at every family table. Show montage. Old soldiers sitting quietly, women hanging laundry beside ruins. The war had ended for the world. But for those who lived it, it lingered in dreams, in smells, in songs. I learned to live with it, not to erase it. Because memory, even painful, is what keeps peace alive. And maybe that was the true lesson of our captivity. Not how to survive defeat, but how to live with remembrance. That winter, I wrote back to Frank. I told him about my work, about Anna, about the new Germany rising from the ashes. At the end, I added one line: "You were right. I did help rebuild, not just the land, but myself." By the early 1960s, Germany was almost unrecognizable. The cities that had once been rubble now shimmered with glass towers and busy streets. Children ran where tanks had once stood. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, they called it, and it truly was. Show bustling street in West Germany, neon lights glowing, trams passing through rebuilt squares. I worked as a supervisor in a manufacturing plant outside Stuttgart. We made precision tools. Small, intricate, efficient. It was honest work. And for the first time, I felt like we were building something that would last. But behind every sound of machinery, every hum of progress, there were echoes. Faint, buried, but persistent. Sometimes, during lunch breaks, I watched the younger workers, men who had been born after the war. They laughed easily, spoke freely, and questioned everything. To them, the war was a story from a distant past, something their fathers mumbled about after too much beer. Show young factory workers joking, smoke, drifting in sunlight. They didn't understand the silence that hung over our generation, the quiet guilt, the invisible shame. I envied them. And at the same time, I feared what forgetting might do to them. One afternoon, one of the apprentices, barely 20, asked me, "Sir, were you really in America as a prisoner?" I nodded. He smiled, as if it were some kind of adventure. "What was it like?" he asked. I hesitated, then said softly, "It was the first time I saw what freedom looks like when people aren't afraid." He didn't understand. How could he? He had grown up in a world where fear was no longer part of daily life. In 1963, President Kennedy came to Berlin. I remember standing by a small radio, listening as his voice echoed across the city. "Ich bin ein Berliner." Show archival footage, Kennedy waving to crowds in West Berlin. For us who had seen both destruction and rebirth, those words carried a strange power. They weren't about politics. They were about recognition, that we, once enemies, now stood as part of something shared. That night, I thought about the contrast. 18 years earlier, I had stood behind barbed wire in Kansas, wondering if my country would ever rise again. And now, the leader of the free world was declaring solidarity with US. It felt like history had turned in a full circle, but this time, toward light. Still, The past had its own way of resurfacing. Point one day, I received an invitation from the local government, a request to speak at a school about my wartime experiences. 4 years, I'd avoided such things. But something in me said it was time. Show quiet classroom. Rows of attentive students. The room was full of young faces. Curious, eager, innocent. I told them about the war, the surrender, the camps, the voyage across the ocean. About seeing the Liberty ships, the factories, the kindness that had shattered my hatred. When I finished, a student raised his hand and asked, "Do you forgive yourself for fighting for that regime?" The question struck like a blade. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "No, but I learned that forgiveness is not something you give yourself. It's something you earn, through how you live afterward." The room fell silent. Some looked down. Others just stared. It wasn't comfort they expected. It was truth. After the lecture, one of the teachers approached me. She said, "You speak with such peace." I smiled faintly. "Peace," I replied, "is not the absence of guilt. It's learning to carry it without letting it destroy you." Show close-up of the teacher and veteran shaking hands in corridor light. That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories flooded back, the cries, the fires, the smell of iron and smoke. I realized that time doesn't erase anything. It only softens the edges so that we can bear looking at it again. In 1965. My wife Anna gave birth to our first son, Lucas. Holding him in my arms was like holding the proof that life could win, even after everything. Show tender scene, newborn wrapped in blanket, faint lullaby. Playing, when he was old enough to walk, I took him to the rebuilt Frauenkirche in Dresden. It was still being restored. Stone by stone, I wanted him to see where I came from. The ashes, the silence, the pain. He looked up at the scaffolding and asked, "Papa, who broke it?" I said quietly, "We did." Then, after a pause, "But we're fixing it now." That seemed to satisfy him. But for me, it was a reminder that rebuilding was not just about cities, it was about souls. The following year, I traveled to America for the first time since the war. It was a business trip. Our company was negotiating a partnership with an American firm in Illinois. When the plane landed, and I stepped onto the tarmac, I froze. The air smelled the same: diesel, grass, coffee. For a moment, I wasn't a businessman. I was that 21-year-old prisoner again, staring out at a land of machines and light. Show arrival at Chicago Airport, soft focus on face filled with nostalgia. During my stay, I found Frank. He was older now, gray-haired but still smiling the same easy smile. When he saw me, he laughed and said, "Took you long enough to come back." We talked for hours about work, family, and how the world had changed. At one point, he said, "You Germans build things better now than anyone. You learned fast." I answered, "We had good teachers." We both laughed, but behind the laughter was something deeper, a quiet understanding that once the world had torn us apart, and now it had brought us together again. On my last day in America, I visited the old campsite in Kansas. The barracks were gone. The fields were open again, covered in wheat. Only a small plaque remained, marking the place where prisoners had once stood. Show wind blowing across open Kansas prairie, camera slowly panning over memorial plaque. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind, the same sound I'd heard 20 years earlier. It wasn't the sound of captivity anymore. It was the sound of peace. I realized then that America had never really been my enemy. It had been my teacher. Harsh, powerful, unrelenting, but just. When I returned home, Anna asked what it was like to see it all again. I said, "It felt like seeing the past forgive me." She didn't ask what I meant. She just placed her hand on mine and said, "Then you can finally rest." And for the first time in decades, I believed her. But the story didn't end there. Because peace, like freedom, isn't something you inherit, it's something you protect, day by day, memory by memory, and soon, the world would once again test whether we had truly learned that lesson. It is 1975 now, 3 decades since the guns fell silent. Sometimes, when I look out my window and see my grandson playing in the garden, I wonder how such a peaceful world could have grown from so much ruin. Show warm evening light, child running through grass, veteran watching quietly from window. Germany is prosperous, united in its work if not yet in its borders. Our factories hum, our streets shine, our people smile again. But behind every smile lies the faint shadow of memory. A quiet reminder of how fragile all of this truly is. That I often ask myself whether the world remembers what it cost to learn these lessons. Or whether, as always, time is burying the warning too deep beneath comfort and progress. I'm an old man now, but I still dream of Kansas sometimes, the wind across the fields, the sound of tractors, the calm order of life. That I can still smell the oil and wheat. Show slow pan over golden Kansas fields, clouds drifting lazily. It's strange. I went there as a prisoner, yet that land gave me my freedom. Not through release, but through understanding, through realizing that power means nothing without mercy. When I came home, I thought I had left America behind. But over the years, I understood. I had brought it with me. Not the place, but the idea. That dignity could exist even in defeat, and that forgiveness could rebuild what hatred had burned. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, I was invited to speak at a memorial in Dresden. It was a quiet ceremony. Veterans, widows, children, no flags. No speeches about victory or defeat. Just silence and the slow ringing of a church bell. Show close-up of cracked church bell ringing amid crowd, people holding candles. I stood on the same square where, 40 years earlier, the air had burned and buildings had melted into ash. Now, birds flew between rebuilt rooftops, and children held hands. When my turn came to speak, I said only this: we thought strength was in destruction, but real strength is in creation, and in remembrance. Let us never be strong enough to forget. The crowd didn't applaud. They just stood there, many with tears in their eyes, and I felt something lift from me. Not forgiveness, but release. After the ceremony, a man approached me. American, gray-haired, wearing a small veteran's pin. He introduced himself as Robert, a former U.S. Guard from a camp in Texas. He said he had come to see what Germany had become. We sat on a bench for an hour. Two old men who had once been enemies, now sharing stories about grandchildren and gardens. At one point he said, "You know, we never hated you. We just wanted the killing to stop." I nodded. "And we never believed that until you fed us." Show shot of two men shaking hands beside memorial ruins, late afternoon sun glinting on stone. That handshake. It felt like the war's final echo fading away. Time went on, as it always does. My son became an engineer, my grandson a student. They live without fear, without hunger, without war. Sometimes Lucas asks me, "Grandfather, do you think there could ever be another war like that?" I take a long breath before I answer. Yes. I tell him, if people forget how easily it begins, with pride, with silence, with obedience. He looks confused when I say that, and maybe that's good, because if he can't imagine it, then perhaps he'll never see it. Show montage, modern Germany, children playing, workers smiling, rebuilt Dresden shining in sunrise. The world today moves faster than ever. Machines are smarter, cities brighter, nations richer. But the human heart hasn't changed. It still hungers for power, for belonging, for meaning. That's why remembrance matters. Because memory isn't just about the past. It's a map for the Future. Every bridge I've helped build, every machine I've repaired, every young man I've trained, all of it, in some quiet way, has been a form of apology, not in words, but in creation. Now, in the twilight of my life, I sometimes sit at my desk and open the box where I've kept the few letters from my years as a prisoner. Among them is one from Frank, the last he ever sent before he passed, it says. We both fought different wars, but we ended up building the same peace. Take care, my friend. The world needs builders more than ever. Show old hands unfolding letter, paper yellowed with age. I still keep that letter beside my tools. It reminds me that the real victory wasn't won in 1945. It was won in the years that followed. Every time an enemy became a neighbor. So when people ask me what I remember most, the battles, the camps, the hunger, I tell them no. What I remember most is the first time I saw a field of golden wheat stretching to the horizon, and a country that had defeated us not with hatred, but with industry, mercy, and faith in its own humanity. That was the moment I realized. The war had ended, but not for us. Not until we learned to be human again. Show final wide shot. German countryside at sunrise, fields glistening, wind blowing softly. Now, as I close my eyes, I hope my grandson will live in a world that never forgets what we paid to learn that simple truth. Because peace, like freedom, is never inherited. It is built, again and again, by those who remember.